So let's begin with where we ended off. So at the end we had these two questions, right? In what way philosophy shapes the aims, methods and content of education, and can you provide examples from your own educational experiences that illustrate these influences? So before we can begin today's class, let us quickly see what are your views on these two questions. Okay, so let's take the first question first. In what way do you feel that philosophy shapes the aims, methods and the content? Now we have had around a series of 6 classes maybe looking at different approaches. So which one how do you feel that philosophy helps to allow education to achieve its goal? Okay, critical examination of methods, then so moral plus ethical development, holistic growth, emotional development, good. Okay, also intellectual. Okay, so it centered of focused learning, okay, so these are some of the ways we have seen that how it can contribute. Now from your own experience, okay, of primary, secondary, higher secondary and graduate studies and even some postgraduate in some cases, how can you see the influence of philosophy in all that you have done so far in your studies? Whether it be state school or ICSE, CBSE, etc. See, one example is in certain schools we see that it is not only intellectual formation, but also you learn certain skills. Okay, so you have skill based education also. So where there is emphasis given on certain skills in the IT sector as well as basic things like horse riding, leisure activities, etc. are also emphasized. Okay, so sports is one. Okay, some kind of outreach. Okay, and what could be one of the goals of such outreach programs? What could be some of the goals of such outreach programs? Okay, to be in a way sensitive, understanding. You were saying something when we were. Okay. Okay, so still you all can reflect on this, look at certain examples and try to apply it to what you have seen so far. Okay, so today what we'll do is we'll take a look at certain heterodox schools of Indian philosophy and we will try to see their educational system. Okay, so we will first and foremost know about these heterodox schools then we will focus our attention on the educational system of Buddhism and Jainism. We'll also identify distinct features of Buddhism and Jainism and also try to understand their contribution in education. Now obviously the other Indian schools we will not deal with here because already it is dealt with in the other course on Indian philosophy, okay, in details, for example yoga, Sankhya, etc. So these we shall take a look, and from your last year's course on Introduction to World Religions there will be certain concepts which also will be looking here. So it will also be a kind of a revision for you. So this is basically the outline of this unit. Okay, main focus on Buddhism and Jainism. So in a way we can say that when we speak of the Indian tradition of philosophical thinking, there is no one term which will encapsulate all. And in such a way we see that even though Vedanta is a dominant philosophical tradition, it is not the sole system of thought. And therefore, if we only emphasize and highlight Vedanta, we see that, and if we don't focus on Buddhism, Jainism, we see that we are losing out on a vast chunk of Indian tradition of philosophical thought. So obviously, what are the schools that do not accept the Vedas called? There is a term, right, for schools that do not accept the authority of the Vedas? The Nastika, right? Or the unorthodox? So, we'll take a look at three. You have the Charvaka, you have the Buddhist philosophy and the Jain philosophy. So, Charvaka we see that is characterized as a materialistic and aesthetic school of thought. And here we see that direct perception is accepted as the surest means to prove something as true. Okay, surest means to prove the truth of anything. On the other hand, when we look at Buddhism, who is the founder? So we see that Buddhism or Buddhist philosophy is based on the teachings of Gautam Buddha. Now, can anyone tell me what are the two main kind of teachings which are there? No, those are the schools, right? So when you have the main teachings of the Buddha, which are the two main? Okay, so you have something called as this, okay, Four Noble Truths, and you have the Eightfold Path. As we go further, we'll come back to this. When we look at Jain philosophy, we see that it was already in existence in the 6th century BC, revived by Mahavira, who was the 24th Tirthankara. So this is basically an outline of this. We will deal with these two schools of thought in this particular unit. So when we look at Buddhism, we see that it is one of the most remarkable development of Indian thought. It is an offshoot. Buddhist philosophy is an offshoot of later Vedic thought. And in a way, it is founded on the rejection of certain orthodox Hindu philosophical concepts. At the same time, it also shares some concepts with Hinduism. And which could these be? What does Buddhism share? Is there anything common, some beliefs that are shared between Buddhism and Hinduism? Okay, karma is one. Moksha. Then also there is the cause and effect relation. Then you also have whole cycle, moksha, to come out of the cycle of birth and rebirth. Now we see that also another thing which they believe here is events that happen are as a result or the consequence of previous events. And therefore, what can be the ultimate goal, or what is the ultimate goal of both? Okay, first and foremost is to end the cycle of birth, rebirth, and attain freedom from suffering, which is moksha or nirvana. And next is to eliminate karma. So this is a little bit of Buddhist philosophy. We'll come to certain concepts a bit later. So when we speak about freedom from suffering, how many type of levels of suffering are identified? How many levels of suffering are there? Okay, so first and foremost, what are the Four Noble Truths? There is suffering is one, then there is the cause of suffering, next there is a cessation or end of suffering, and finally there is a way to end this suffering, which is the Eightfold Path. So now when it comes to suffering, we see that there are three levels, right? Which are those three? Anybody can tell me? Okay, so when we look at this, so there are three levels. So the first we have ordinary, so dukkha as ordinary suffering. So what will this include? When we speak about dukkha as ordinary suffering, in a way this is one of the most apparent or immediate form of suffering, which includes physical and mental pain. So here what comes under this will be your physical pain, illnesses, physical discomfort, also emotional pain such as grief. Okay, so you have physical plus also added to this is hardships such as damage caused by natural disasters or loss of loved ones, etc. Okay, so this would come under the ordinary suffering. So here we see that it is direct and intense, and in a way it is universal. All are supposed to undergo this. Sickness, death, old age, in a way inevitable. All of us are going to go through it at some point of time or the other. Then you have something as dukkha as produced by change. So any thoughts on this? What is the difference between dukkha as ordinary suffering and dukkha as a result of change, as produced by change? So here we see that this arises as a realization of the impermanence of things. Okay, and therefore when it comes to arises from changes in life which are inevitable. So for example, there is something good going on in your life, suddenly it ends. You're working, have a very comfortable salary, suddenly one day you get fired, end of it. Next, transitions. You are in one place, enjoying luxury, comfort, good company. Suddenly you are put in a place where everything is taken away. Okay, so and then what happens is, you are still kind of ruminating over those experiences. Though you may be physically present in the new place, you are still thinking of those old experiences which can also cause suffering. So we see that if this is immediate, if ordinary suffering is immediate, dukkha as produced by change is subtle. Okay, and this basically comes from the tendency to hold on. That means we are not willing to let go of the past, we hold on to it and it causes us suffering. So attachments will come under this. And then you have, what is the third level? Dukkha as conditioned states. So this basically is one of the most profound, and in this way it is related to our existential being. So rooted in our very existence. So in short, if we have to say in simple words, we can compare this in three levels. So the first level we have ordinary suffering. Second level you have that produced by change. And the third level you have the dukkha as conditioned states. This basically arises because of the 5 aggregates, right? There are the 5 aggregates in Buddhism, right? Which are they? There is physical form, then there is feeling, perception, mindfulness and concentration. Okay, so these dukkha as conditioned states arises because of these 5 aggregates. So anyway, that we can look some other time, but in short we see that ordinary suffering, well, all are able to experience this. You need to go a little bit interior into yourself, introspect to have an understanding of this suffering as a result of change. And suffering as conditioned states is possible only when you reach a deeper level of awareness. That when you focus on the teachings of the Buddha, when you realize the whole understanding of suffering, why it happens, etc., only then can you get an understanding of this and ultimately the freedom. Okay, so third one in a way will be, for example, we have something called as the dark night of the soul, this churning that happens inside, this interior movement, that could be one example. Secondly, also certain uncertainties in your life. You are thinking about your insecurities, okay, and that also can cause a lot of suffering. So this would come under dukkha as conditioned states. So when we look at the Buddhist educational system, we see that these teachings of the Buddha also in a way influence the educational system. So first and foremost, educational system was founded by Gautam Buddha himself, and in a way we cannot say that he was a philosopher as such. Okay, we can say that he was primarily an ethical teacher and reformer. Now, why do we think we can call Gautam Buddha as an ethical teacher? Why do we call him as an ethical teacher?
Leading to discrimination.
Okay, one thing is there, he was, as you also said, he did not agree with certain systems of the Hinduism school, okay, and therefore wanted to do away with it. As you said, he did not also, he avoided discussions of metaphysical questions, we'll come to that later. But if you look back at the life of the Buddha, okay, when he attained enlightenment, what happens then? Yeah, before he began teaching, there is something that happens, right? So once he attains enlightenment, he was in a way afraid to go out. He wanted to only keep that for himself. Then you have a person called Brahman Sampati who comes and in a way convinces him of becoming and accepting a vocation of a teacher. And you have this imagery of the lotus pond, saying that some lotuses remain below the water, some reach to the surface of the water, and only some are able to break the surface of the water and come out. Therefore, it is your duty to teach others how to come out of this suffering. Okay, so that is why in this way we can call him as an ethical teacher. Next, we see that he was mainly concerned with the problems of life, that is suffering. So, when you look at the life of the Buddha, there are 4 main instances, right, which lead him to reflect on his life. What are those? So, one, he sees a sick person, then old age, then a dead body or a dead corpse, and what was the 4th? A sage, an ascetic person, right? So he says that how can this man be in peace in spite of all these things that are happening around him? So therefore, he was mainly concerned with coming out or breaking from this suffering of life and getting freedom from it. And therefore, he avoided discussions on any metaphysical questions. Why? Because he basically felt that these were ethically useless and in a way they were intellectually uncertain. That means you can go on thinking, you can go on talking about these things and it will not have any end. And therefore, for him what was important is to look at the practical aspects, something that can help the people overcome their suffering. So therefore, for him the most important question was suffering its ending, how to end it, and what path can be followed in order to end the suffering. So, as we know, he had his enlightenment, and that led him to the four noble truths. There is suffering, there is a cause of suffering, cessation of suffering, and a way to end suffering. And therefore we see that Buddhist philosophy of life was in a way to get nirvana or end of suffering. And how is this possible? Through the eightfold path. So next, we won't go into this in detail. You'll have already done this in the last course. The eightfold path: right faith, right resolve, right speech, right action, right living, right thought, right concentration, and right effort. Okay, and maybe when you'll get the time, you can also look at the relevance of this in today's world, whether it is relevant, whether you all feel it is challenging, etc. Now let's go to the educational philosophy of Buddhism, which is supposed to be the main crux of this unit. So first and foremost, we see that Buddhist education wanted to impart education to all. And because this was its goal, we see that many people shifted to Buddhism. In other schools of thought, we see that it was only a few who had the privilege or the access to learn. Okay, whereas here education was imparted to all, and this was the first time education was in a way institutionalized on a large scale, and this happened during the Buddhist movement. Also, it is said that with the arrival of the Buddhist era, great centers of education were in prominence. Like you have Nalanda, Takshashila, Vikramshila, Balabi, Nadia, Amravati, and Sarnath. And we see that these educational centers were developed in Viharas or the Sangha. Now, from the teachings of Buddhism, which you have already seen, can you all tell what can be some of the aims of the Buddhist education system? Just a few wild ideas. What do you think can be? You have already studied the Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist thought. Based on that, what can be the aims of education in Buddhism? Okay, morality is one. Any other? Something to do with the final end? Okay, final end to nirvana. Any other? Okay, self-realization. Any other aims can there be? Well, let's take a look at some. First is to follow the moral values of the Buddhist religion. Okay, so one of the key factors here is the whole aspect of the impermanence, non-attachment. Another one also is to adopt good conduct and supposed to be to adopt good conduct and non-violence. Next is to achieve the final goal of nirvana. And this is, we see that he also, as we have already seen, gives practical ways. The whole Eightfold Path can be seen as a practical guideline to achieve nirvana. Another aim also was to propagate Buddhism. So we see that these great educational institutes in the past, they always had their legacy. For even now we see our schools, etc. There is some, apart from the education, there is some values that is imparted to the students as well. So here also, next also was to end the Vedic karma kanda or ritualism. The whole concept of ritualism which was there, to put an end to it. So there are a few more which are there, which we'll take a look next time. So we'll wind up for today and keep thinking about some more, and also try to revise a bit of the Buddhist thought that you learned last year. So it will be useful to catch up with this.